Welcome to everybody. I'm Eric Bruns. I'm a professor in the University of Washington School of Medicine, and I'm an associate director of the SMART Center. I also have the pleasure of serving as the principal investigator for the SMART Center's postdoctoral research training program. And this is a training grant funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences, that has brought us 3 fantastic young education researchers that I'll introduce you to virtually in just a second. It also provides a source of support for our speaker series. So we are very grateful for that, for this funding. So you can see up here a little bit about our series this year. This is our second year, I believe, in doing a full series. We kicked off in December with Rhonda Neese from the University of Oregon. In March, we hosted Anne Gregory from Rutgers University. And last month, we had an amazing presentation from Eileen Schwartz and Ginger Kwan on community academic collaboration. You can watch the recordings on our website. You will see links being shared in the chat box. And in addition to today's presentation, we have one more presentation for which you can still register. And it's going to be amazing, as it will be from our own Janine Jones, also from the UW College of Education. And again, the link will be shared in the chat box for registering for next month's. Before we get started, a very important acknowledgement that the University of Washington and the SMART Center live, learn, train, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us, and those who still walk here. We are grateful to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. A little bit about the SMART Center. This is a little picture of us circa December 2019, when we still had the pleasure of working together in person. Our overall mission is to promote high quality, culturally responsive programming to meet the full range of social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all students through research, training, technical assistance, and support to policy making. So just a tiny bit about the SMART Center. What kinds of things do we do to try to live up to that mission and make it happen? In a nutshell, we conduct basic research on school mental health and multi-tiered systems of educational support. For example, our team just recently published a meta-analysis of dozens of original research studies that confirmed that schools are the venue in which children and youth are most likely to receive mental health services and supports. We also develop and test specific school mental health interventions and other strategies that fit within the multi-tiered systems of educational support. So we're really committed to developing and testing models that work for students and for schools, districts, and communities. And perhaps even more critically, we ask how we and the field of school mental health can make best use of evidence about what works through our Training and Technical Assistance Center that provides training, consultation, and other kinds of supports. And finally, we do research on school mental health implementation. We also try to be at the table with funders and policymakers to reinforce what the lessons have been learned from research on effective school mental health. So if you'd like to learn more about us, you can visit our website. Really quickly, I told you about our fantastic postdoctoral fellows. These include Stephanie Brewer, Kathy Corbin, Maria Hugh, and Courtney Zuloff-McCurdy, who is going to be our Q&A discussant today. So you'll be seeing Courtney shortly at the end of Dr. Elliott-Groves' talk. Here is our website. You can just Google UW Smart Center, and usually I think it pops up pretty readily. We also like to be active on Twitter and other social media. If you'd like to sign up to follow us, you'll get all sorts of news from the field of school mental health and implementation science. On the topic of providing high quality training in TA, the SMART Center Speaker Series is also being sponsored by the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which supports the school mental health workforce in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And there's a bunch of ways you can get in touch with this center as well. So sign up to receive our newsletters and get news about what the MHTTC offers. So again, I am so pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Emma Elliott-Groves, Learning Sciences and Human Development in the College of Education at the University of Washington. The SMART Center is a collaborative, so we are extremely excited to be able to, particularly excited that she will be our speaker today. So a large part of Dr. Elliott-Groves' research centers on understanding the meanings and explanations of suicidal behavior from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. By employing a strengths-based approach to recovery, Dr. Elliott-Groves rigorously engages youth, families, and communities in the development of integrated behavioral health interventions to address complex social issues. Her research centers on ethical frameworks generated by Indigenous and place-based knowledge and practices to create process-centered approaches that illuminate Indigenous pathways toward collective livelihood. And can I just say that as someone working within an academic center that conducts research as well as provides training and technical assistance, or at least attempts to do so as best we can, to school districts and communities, I'll be listening very carefully, as we here at the SMART Center have so much to learn from scholars and doers such as Dr. Elliott-Groves about how best to do our work in a way that is engaging of community members and culturally responsive. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Emma Elliott-Groves. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruns. Asiam natsiaya, plum utsia tala, heitzapka, ni alpmuts atana quail, yath ut hakwashta, natsamachqualoan, heitzapka. Greetings and prayers in my own language. I'm joining you today from the ancestral and contemporary territories of the Lushootseed-speaking peoples here in Seattle, Washington, including the Duwamish, the Muckleshoot, Suquamish, Tulalip, Snoqualmie, and Puyallup nations. As a descendant of people from this territory, I want to welcome you. I give thanks to our relatives, the clouds, the mountains, the trees, the sky, the water, and to our plant and animal nations and our ancestors for always welcoming me and sustaining me and holding me up. I speak from a specific place as a Cowichan Hwamach person, that's a Cowichan person, and I want to acknowledge that place here. I'm grateful to all of you for joining, and especially to those of you for joining from Cowichan territory. I give thanks to the UW Smart Center and to the Northwest MHTTC for the invitation to share some of what I know. This talk has been developed in collaboration with Dr. Megan Bang based on a paper that we're working on together. And I'm grateful to all of you, as well as to Dr. Bruns and Schmidt. And also thank you to Meg and Lucy for all their work in organizing this event. My name is Emma Elliott-Groves, and I'm Cowichan, or Cowichan, from Vancouver Island, British Columbia. My great-grandparents were Abraham and Ellen Johnny, Charlie Rice and Hilda Wesley Bobb, Joseph Peters and Mary Jane Wise, and John and Emma Elliott. My dad here on the top left was Gordon Elliott. He was an activist for First Nations fishing rights, and in his time here on Earth, he and others built a traditional fishing weir that you see here on the bottom right-hand corner across the Cowichan River in opposition to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who said that we couldn't fish for food. Today, our tribe has a fish hatchery and fishing rights as a result of some of the work that they did. I share this photo with you and this story with you in honor of my dad. In the middle, you see a photo of my mom, Della Sylvester. She's a First Nations medicine person who has learned about plants as medicine all her life from her aunties and grandmothers and shares some of what she knows today. On the top right is a photo of my husband and my two children, Caspian and Story. These three are some of my biggest reasons for being. And on the bottom, you see a photograph of my wedding, and these are some of the folks that are nearest and dearest to me. Now, I share with you some of these photographs and some of these stories to give you a glimpse about who I am as a Cowichan person and how my understandings of the world have always been a really important part, and especially my relationships. I invite you to draw an understanding of how I interpret and approach my work, how I see the world, how I come to know what I know, and why I do what I do. So today I want to share with you several stories related to survival and transcendence, to think about Indigenous community psychology. I want to offer Indigenous understandings of relationality coupled with participatory design and theories of communal change. in a way that can help us think about how we can uncover strategies to shift the way we think about and address Indigenous mental health. This talk calls for an intentional paradigm shift from separation to connection, from fear to hope, from destruction to restoration, and from prevention to transformation. We think that by shedding light on the interdependence of life on Earth as understood through Indigenous systems of relationality, we can cultivate spaces for healthy, equitable, democratic, diverse, beautiful, fun, and restorative healing, not just for Indigenous people, but for all peoples and all living beings. So first, I'm going to do a brief overview about why mainstream and normative approaches to understanding psychological functioning isn't enough for Indigenous people. Then I'll provide an overview of our understandings of Indigenous well-being, followed by theories of communal change. I'll give you an example of research that I conducted in my own community based on some of these principles. And finally, I'll finish this talk by offering stories of survival and transcendence as a way for us to think about and think together how we might continue the work of transforming from prevention to transformation, particularly for Indigenous communities. This talk was developed in response to the following two questions. First, in what ways can Indigenous knowledge systems inform collective health and wellness? And secondly, what can theories of participatory design and communal change offer Indigenous community psychology? So I want to point out some problems with our mainstream understandings of human psychological functioning to highlight why these approaches don't do justice when thinking about Indigenous community health. A 2008 survey of the top psychology journals found that 96% of psychology subjects represent only 12% of the world's population, with 70% of those citations coming from within the United States. We erase diversity at our own peril. And a large part of this talk calls for epistemic heterogeneity, or an understanding of knowledge systems from diverse and multiple perspectives. This assumption of universality has deep practical, political, social, and everyday implications for our understanding of human psychological functioning, and more broadly, our understanding of human nature and the nature of knowledge itself. Mainstream understandings prioritize individuality and do not always consider the interdependent nature of Indigenous communities. As human beings, though, we don't exist in social or cultural isolation. And so I feel, and therefore, it's really difficult for me to imagine that transformative healing and restoration can take place in isolation. Mainstream approaches prioritize categorical definitions of disease. This is what the DSM-4 is. And here in the United States, disease promotion is incentivized. There are issues with sample non-diversity, methodological non-diversity, and researcher non-diversity. Researchers often adapt interventions that have been developed by and normed for the non-Hispanic white population, which doesn't align with Indigenous onto-epistemologies or axiological understandings of the world. That is, what we know, how we come to know it, and what ethical frameworks guide our everyday existence. Nor do they often take into consideration our concept of personhood, which is related to our land, our language, and our relational responsibilities. In outcome-based science, such as randomized controlled trials, researchers specify desired outcomes ahead of time, which doesn't leave a lot of space for human beings to generate culturally novel solutions. But what about human potentiality? We know that people learn and grow and heal in everyday social and cultural contexts, and that for all of us, nothing matters more than the relationships in these processes. Indigenous peoples' identities, languages, and thought processes have been developed in relation to life, livelihoods, and land, which centers on strengths-based and process-oriented understandings, rather than outcome-based approaches. In community psychology, we call a vast majority of these approaches evidence-based research and practice. But I ask, whose evidence? Because Indigenous peoples have thousands and thousands of years of ancestral knowledge that tells us what it means to be a person and how to heal in ways that are sustainable and relational. As Judith Butler notes, certain kinds of practices which are designed to handle certain kinds of problems produce over time a settled domain of ontology, and their consequences and this ontological domain in turn constrains our understanding of what is possible. We then come to believe that that's just the way things are, even though it's not. This means that how we go about designing interventions produces certain types of states, that's affective states, that either expand or foreclose certain possible futures. So there's importance in intentionally designing educational and mental health research and practice in ways that cultivate different states of being. And in doing so, we open or expand different possible futures. So although time precludes any sort of historical overview of First Nations and Native American histories of trauma in relation to colonialism, it's suffice to say that in some cases we've experienced over 530 years of resistance to settler colonialism, land dispossession, slavery, genocide, epistemicide. And if you want to know more and get more information about that, Dr. Karina Walters has put together a beautiful chronological timeline that tells us a little bit more about these historical traumatic events, settler colonial policies, and Native resistance at nativephilanthropy.candid.org. In this talk, we reframe our existence by drawing on the words of my dear friend Abigail Echohawk, the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute and the chief research officer at the Seattle Indian Health Board. She shares, "We are not historically a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors survived so that I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I'm colonially underserved. I am institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient." So first, I want to give you a little overview of Indigenous systems of relationality. Indigenous peoples understand themselves to be in vast systems of relationships with plant and animal nations, natural world relations such as our mountains and our waterways, as well as our ancestral relations. And imbued within this vast system of relationships are also a relational responsibility characterized by respect and reciprocity and a deep commitment to be stewards of these relationships and of these beings. Drawing on Dr. Leanne Bidamasamasake Simpson, she says, "My ancestors accumulated networks of meaningful, deep, fluid, intimate, collective, and individual relationships of trust. In times of hardship, we did not rely to any great degree on accumulated capital or individualism, but on the strength of our relationships with others." I'm Cowichan, and who we are as Cowichan Hwalmach, that is, our sense of collective identity as Cowichan people, is deeply associated with our land. The land holds the bones of our ancestors, and so too our individual and collective identities are developed in relation to the land across generations. Our Indigenous systems of relationality shape every single facet of our existence, including the ways that we see the world, how we come to know, and ultimately why we do what we do. Our languages have been developed in relation to our land and provide deep and nuanced pathways towards health and restoration. In short, who we are as people and what our purpose or responsibility is in this world is guided by our relationship to our land, which is deeply intertwined with our languages, our identities, and the ways in which we see the world. Given this deep interplay between land, language, identity, and thought, we cannot compartmentalize or individualize our learning or our healing processes. Doing so actually encloses transformative possibilities for Indigenous, Brown, Black, and LGBTQ and 2S, Two-Spirit people and communities. We're interested in doing what we can to contribute to transformative research and practice. And to do this, we offer theories of participatory design and communal change with a deep commitment to Indigenous concepts of relationality. So I want to overview theories of participatory design and communal change. In short, some of these theories emerge out of Indigenous methodologies, cultural psychology, and design-based research. These are theories that are creative, deliberate, and consequential. They involve interdisciplinary engagement in order to develop new designs, narratives, and possibilities. They involve direct application and an iterative design, which allows for theory development as well as new and innovative practical approaches. They take place in complex real-world or informal settings, and they center the work in the community, including having community members at decision-making positions and leadership positions. The project itself is driven entirely by the community. And finally, these types of approaches view human potential and meaning-making as heterogeneous and multi-voiced. I've been trained as a learning scientist and as a social worker. From this standpoint, I want us to think together about what it means to create the conditions for well-being and how this can be informed by research and practice. We want to consider approaches to healing that are collaborative, collective, and agentic, that are dynamic, nonlinear, and adaptive, and that are in response to social and cultural context. This is how we define expansive healing as we seek to create novel transformations in community psychology that are localized, sustainable, and relational. Briefly, transformative agency refers to points of conflict or discomfort, or clusters of volitional actions that break away from well-constraining frames. This has something to do with imagination and creativity, and all of us, particularly because of the global pandemic, are in a moment of chaos. And through this chaos, new possibilities can emerge because of this idea of transformative agency. In the context of Indigenous mental health, this has to do with leaning into the space of the discomfort of pushing back against some of these constraining frames. So today, this talk helps us think about the ways in which we can push that helps us push against and think deeply about our methods, our practices, our theoretical approaches, and ultimately our life's work. And as we think together, we too are engaged in a shared form of transformative agency. You see, this space involves questioning, dreaming, and a search for new possibilities. We're seeking possibilities that are local and sustainable, that allow for experimentation and human potential. And in these spaces, they require polymotivated problem solving and allow for collective analysis and self-determination. There are dimensions of co-design that cultivate transformative agency that include some of these elements, and of course are not limited to disrupting historically powered relationships, accounting for critical historicity, power, and relationality, that involve epistemic heterogeneity and push us to ask questions like, how are we doing the work? For what purpose are we doing the work? For whom and with whom are we doing the work, the research, and the design of our practice? It involves dynamic role remediation. That is, community members and researchers have dynamic roles, and all participants are involved in the design, the decision-making, the analysis, the writing. So this is pushing us to think further and to take the next step about what it means to work with Indigenous communities in relation to decision-making processes and power. It necessitates a deep interrogation of theories of communal change, forms of praxis, that's the ways in which we bring theory to the community or to everyday practice, and our axiological commitments, that's the ways that we're guided by our ethics and morals. Design, it involves a design commitment to receiving, cultivating, and building capacity towards social change. That is, it involves an intentional design commitment towards sustainability. So now that I've given a little bit of overview about some theories of participatory design and communal change, as well as given you an overview of my understanding of Indigenous systems of relationality, I want to share with you a research project that I did in collaboration with the Cowichan tribes, or with some members of the Cowichan tribes on Vancouver Island, just as an example about how we can think about expanding our practice through co-design. The intention of this project was to co-design a place-based biopsychosocial assessment. And in social work, the biopsychosocial assessment is aimed at assessing the social, developmental, and mental health of people in order to provide some sort of diagnosis. So what we did is we designed across 4 phases and implemented a Cowichan biopsychosocial assessment. First, I engaged elders in conversations about what it means to be guiding the guiding question for this is, what is it? It was exactly that. What does it mean for us? Who are we as people? We took young people and their families on a walk with a First Nations medicine person. In these walks, we asked young people to gather or harvest items that represented each of their relationships. They gathered shells and stones, pieces of bark, plants, and other items to represent their own system and of self-identified relationships. They were then asked to create an art project representation of these relationships. And using that art project as an artifact, we then conducted a narrative interview and a follow-up interview. In our interviews, we asked the guiding question, tell me the story about. And these interviews were essentially based on Indigenous understandings of oral story. In one example, a young person represented her relationship with her mother as a shell, because her mother was a protector for her in the same way that the shell was a protector for the animal that lived there. But also, she told me that her mother was sometimes fragile. This allowed me the space as a social worker, but in this case, an auntie, to say something like, tell me more about the time when your mom was a protector. Tell me more about the time when your mom was fragile. In this process, young people were able to self-identify their systems of relationships, to use Indigenous teaching and learning practices such as metaphor and oral storytelling as a means to describe their relationships. And through their stories, we were able to conduct a typical biopsychosocial assessment for each young person in a way that was culturally responsive, interdependent, locally specific, and disrupted typical power relations between therapists and clients. This process helped situate the young people in everyday interaction that also likely strengthened their sense of belonging and connection, two things necessary for learning and overall well-being. To give you an idea of what some of these design commitments look like that emerged out of our initial focus group, I have these listed here. First, our elders shared that everything is related. They talked about this concept of Indigenous relationality, that we're related to people, plants, animals, the natural world, and our ancestors. They talked about the importance of our place and told me stories about where we harvested and how we came to be in this specific place. They talked about the importance of our collective social formation and the importance of participation in the life of our people. They talked about the importance of intergenerational transmission of knowledge and said that our elders and our young people all have something to offer and that we needed to honor these experiences. And finally, they said, we have our own ways, which to me, they were talking about Indigenous pedagogies, which are our teaching and learning practices, such as apprenticeship learning, stories and metaphor, and cultural practices and protocols. So to see how these things sort of emerged or helped inform our actual research design, let's take a look at this slide here. So in terms of relational epistemology, our project was family-based, community-based, and involved plants, animals, and ancestors. At the beginning of our project, for example, we said, who are you in relations with? We named plant, animal, and ancestral relations as a way to launch the project with this particular understanding. We participated in ceremony and prayer at multiple points throughout our project. And we chose this particular biopsychosocial assessment because this is typically the first relational encounter between a therapist and a client. This project took place alongside the Coxsila River, and we used language like we're walking or gathering or fishing in the same places as our ancestors. We talked and included human and more than human entities and landscapes. We participated in a group and in our interviews as well as our art projects. It was intergenerational. On this walk, there were about 25 people, including aunties and uncles and young people from the age of approximately 2 all the way up to 67. And finally, throughout every step of the way, we tried to think about what it meant as Indigenous people to engage our own teaching and learning practices, such as the use of metaphor or story or narrative, or embodied learning or walking the land. All of these things for our people have been ways that we've always learned about and engaged in and observed carefully the rhythms of our natural world. So emerging out of that broad research study, about understanding Indigenous suicidal behavior. My work involves thinking about what it means to create the conditions of well-being for Indigenous communities and their families through research and practice. When I asked Cowichan members in that initial research study about understanding suicide, about the reasons for suicide in our community, they talked about the importance of our land, our cultural practice, and our language. They talked about their relationships and what sustains them. They talked about what brings them life in our ceremony. And at the end of our time here on Earth, we don't ask for our degrees, we don't ask for our Rolexes or our Teslas or our houses or any of these things. What we want here at the end of our time here on Earth is to be next to those that we love. And this tells us that nothing matters more than our relationships. Our broad approach to Indigenous suicide has to do with making sure that our kids don't kill themselves. That's a prevention model. But Cowichan members shared that they were interested in making sure that our kids knew what it means to live. And for us, this is a relational and transformative model. Theories of psychological functioning that articulate a response to harm or a preventative approach continue to reify these normative power dynamics, resulting in sustained norms of passivity and thus no change for our people. A vast majority of the literature talks about the health disparities that Indigenous, Black, Brown, LGBTQ2S, and other institutionally underrepresented communities face without consideration of transformation. Whether it's in the area of education or community mental health, we need to ask ourselves, from what standpoint do we want our children to learn and grow and heal from? From what standpoint do we want our children to experience the world? We therefore ask, what does it mean to live healthful lives? What about our definitions of physical, intellectual, emotional, or spiritual health? Who are we anyway? What does it mean for us to be human beings? What is the story that we want to tell? So with the time remaining, I want to share a few stories of survival and transcendence. Our collective socio-ecological and democratic relationships are in crises, which gives us all the chance to participate in transformative agency. As I share these stories, I want you to think about expansive healing. In what ways do these stories tell us something about collaboration and interdependence? What do they tell us about agency and self-determination? And what do they tell us about healing from and transcending traumatic experiences? So in the spring of 2012, this was the time that I was beginning to think about what I wanted and my dissertation work to be on. Now I knew that I wanted it to be something that was meaningful to my community and also something that I was passionate about. Now my sister doesn't usually call me, she usually Facebook messages me. So I knew that something was up. She called me to tell me that her friend's partner had died by suicide and that she felt like she was walking on eggshells around her friend. She asked me if I knew anything about our stories around suicide. She didn't know if she should mention death by suicide or not. I heard her rushing around, grabbing all the things that she knew that the family would need: blankets, couches, kerchiefs, water, fish. She knew that the family would need certain things. She knew that it was our job as community members to hold up the family during their time of greatest need. She and my brother are cultural knowledge keepers and carry our cultural teachings about how to support others when someone passes away. But somehow this felt different. But what they did know ultimately was that our biggest job during a loss in the community is to be there for the family, to be present, and to help in whatever way we can. And they know that trauma heals in the presence of caring others. When she called me, I didn't have many answers for her. As a researcher, I knew that the very first step in addressing any problem was to understand the issue from the perspective of the community members, and this became my doctoral work. I interviewed elders, young people, and other community members and professional caregivers to understand their explanations for suicide in our community. People shared stories about divorce, loss of children, substance use, and mental health issues. And although these struggles are common explanations for suicide, their explanations were couched in a shared understanding of how colonization has impacted their everyday lives. They talked about how the legacy of residential schooling can still be felt today through fractured family relations and substance use. They discussed their belief that the contemporary governance structure as mandated by the Indian Act doesn't serve the needs of all members equally. Some told me stories of how young adults don't even know where the next meal is going to come from. Others told me that colonization has impacted our ability to hunt, fish, and harvest in our own territory. They also talked about how many of our cultural practices have been impinged upon. And what these stories told me was that in order to understand suicide in our communities, we need to consider individual level factors in relation to multiple historical, social, cultural, and political contexts. We also need to consider and think about these things with our own understandings of land, identity, language, culture, and so on. After all, as human beings, we do not exist in isolation. We will only and always exist in a vast system of social and cultural relationships. And again, nothing matters more than those relationships. So as I was continuing on through my doctoral studies in the spring of 2014, there were 4 additional deaths by suicide on Vancouver Island. These were not all Cowichan members, but every single person in our community was impacted in some way. I found out about this because people were posting things on Facebook like, keep your children close and honor your relations every single day. And as I was standing in the lobby of some hotel in some city at an AERA conference, I started crying because I needed to be home with my family and my community. But I felt like I couldn't. I knew that I had an important research class to take, and I knew that I had important steps to take in terms of my doctoral studies. I felt like I couldn't go home, but my doctoral advisor said to me, "This is your work. This is where you belong. Go home and be with your community." So I did. You see, at this point, I'd been studying and learning about suicide prevention for a couple of years, but I didn't know where to start. I didn't have any money. I didn't have a counseling degree. I was so scared. How could I possibly help? My independent study that quarter literally said something along the lines of being in community to help break the cycle of loneliness, but I didn't know what that looked like or what I should do. All I knew is that this was a life and death situation, and I feared doing more harm than good. I told my mom how scared I was, and she looked at me like First Nations elders do when they know that you already know the answer. And she said, "We sit and we eat together." And I thought, oh, you know what? I can do that. For as long as I remembered, our family has been having family dinners to celebrate the joys and pains of life and living. I remember helping to cook in the big house from a young age. I thought about what it means to eat together. When we're sitting and eating together, we're being present with each other. We're asking each other about each other's day. We're reminding each other how important they are. These everyday moments tell us something about purpose and belonging. We also have cultural teachings around food. We always give thanks for the food that's brought to our table each and every day as it is needed. We give thanks to our plant and animal nations. We also give thanks to the cooks for preparing the food. All of these beings for helping us make sure we have enough food to eat. This tells us something about gratitude and reciprocity. We absorb the knowledge that's shared with us while we're eating and the intention that goes into preparing the food. So when my mom said, "We sit and we eat together," she was reminding me of all of this. And she was reminding me that trauma heals in the presence of caring others. So one morning when I was home during that particular quarter, my uncle knocked on the door and said, "Stephen died this morning. He died from a stroke." As soon as we all heard this news, we began gathering all the things that we knew the family might need. We knew that when someone crosses over, many people in the community begin stopping by to pay their respects, to give a handshake. I went to the family home and began cooking. I knew I could help by preparing some food for the family and the guests. I made simple things like hard-boiled eggs, mush, coffee, toast. My brothers and nephews brought over the benches from the big house so that the people would have a place to sit. They cleared out the living room and covered all the windows and mirrors. After breakfast, the family called me into the living room. They put a blanket around my shoulder and they said, "We'd be honored if you could cook for our family during this time." They would need breakfast at 6 a.m., lunch at noon, and dinner at 5 for the next 4 days for about 40 to 60 people. My mind is racing because you see, I haven't actually cooked in about 10 years. I literally don't cook. My husband is our family cook. And I thought, oh my goodness, Michael is going to have to come to Cowichan to help me cook. Well, with gratitude to Adam and also my recognition that I do know how to cook to some degree, or at least I know how to delegate tasks, we were able to make sure that this happened for the family. Now, I've had a chance to reflect on this. They wouldn't have asked Michael to cook for them. So why do you think they asked me? I learned the answer through my time there. You see, they didn't ask me to cook because I was a great cook. I certainly was not. They asked me to cook because I knew our cultural protocols around funerals and around food. I knew how to hold the space that the family needed. The most important task that I had that week was to be present for the family during their greatest time of need. My long-standing history in the community enabled this family to observe my social interactions and my commitments over time. My understandings of cultural practice and relational epistemology was a part of the reason they asked me. I understood the protocols related to respecting our ancestors, respecting our community, bringing pride to my family and ancestral relations, and the ways in which we've been helping and healing each other all my life and across the generations in family, in community, and in ceremony. My husband, Michael, doesn't have the same historical, cultural, political, or social knowledge, and therefore he would have never been asked, even though he's the best cook I know. The most beautiful thing that I learned that week is that the solutions to any of the predicaments that our communities face are already within our communities, our practices, and our ceremonies. So did you all hear about Tahlequah, the Orca mother who carried the body of her dead baby for 17 days in the Puget Sound near Washington State in 2018? Her baby died a few hours after birth, and at this point, someone reported seeing Tahlequah with about 6 other female orcas gathered at the mouth of a cove in a tight-knit circle. In what the newspapers call the journey of love, Tahlequah had clung to her baby, diving deeply to retrieve the calf each time it slid from her head. She only let her calf go for a few minutes at a time to get food, and when she wasn't holding her calf, another member of her community was. Tahlequah was not alone. Orcas have strong social relational bonds, and their relationships drive much of their behavior. Scientists understand this behavior to be an expression of grief. I want us to think about her grieving process. It was unapologetic, it was visible, it was communal and relational. I want us to think about what we can learn from her about survival and transcendence. What do you think she was trying to tell us? She and her community reminded me again that trauma heals in the presence of caring others. So study after study shows that having a good support network is the most powerful protection against becoming traumatized. In order to recover, mind, body, and brain need to be convinced that it is safe to let go. Relationships provide us with physical and emotional safety, including safety from feeling ashamed or judged, and to strengthen our courage to survive, process, and transcend what has happened. If people have a grief and it is not grieved, it will affect the next generation. It just keeps on reverberating. Once grief is expressed, you can begin healing from it. When we build our support network, we identify relationships that can help us recover, feel physical and emotionally safe, and feel heard, seen, or validated. We know this. So let's think about what this means to enact relational support in the design of our educational and healing spaces. What does this look like if we are to be specific to local knowledge systems, ethical commitments, and understandings of personhood? Now I want to return to our conversation about Indigenous community psychology. Our systems of relationality serve as protective mechanisms against thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, 2 constructs related to death by suicide. Imagine that your systems of relationality are threatened by land theft, environmental contamination, boarding schools, or state-run education, and colonial gender violence. Imagine that your land holds the bones of your ancestors, and therefore your senses of identity, belonging, and purpose are closely related to a specific place. Imagine that this connection with your ancestral territory provides you the foundational understanding of what it means to be a person. Imagine that your relationship to land is dominated and devastated for the purpose of extraction and resource. Imagine your vulnerability to injury, disease, mental stress, food and water insecurity because of that domination. Imagine that your child is taken away from you, threatening your self-determination and your ability to educate, teach, or pass along important knowledge about their development and who they are as a person. Imagine that you are taken from your parents at a young age. And now imagine trying to navigate the world without these important early childhood attachments, cultural teachings, and practices. Imagine being this parent or this child trying to find a sense of belonging or purpose. Imagine being too depressed or anxiety-ridden from being erased from US society, removed from your language and homeland, and targeted with unfair stereotypes about who you are as a person. Or even worse, imagine that you experience state-sanctioned physical or sexual violence because of it. Imagine that you're a Native man trying to provide and protect in a context where Native men are incarcerated, unemployed, or killed by police officers at rates higher than most other populations. Imagine the ongoing colonial gender violence that is evidenced every single time your gender is not represented in talks like this. But what if you were raised in community with elders and others who could teach you the important cultural practices, ethical responsibilities, and the language needed to put it all together? What if your entire sense of self was cultivated by family and social relationships? What if these relationships were so strong that you knew your community would bolster you during your greatest time of need? What if you could self-determine how you, your children, and your community responded and adapted to wide-scale change? What if you could protect your land and therefore your futures? What if we designed our research and practice to ensure that our kids know what it means to live? What if we could do that? You see, I think we can, because we can co-design with local conceptions of land, language, identity, and thought. We can recognize that epistemic heterogeneity matters by incentivizing participant, methodological, or research diversity. We can refuse extraction and harm and stop and interrupt violence and inequity. We can sustain and reclaim Indigenous approaches to education and well-being. We can also center the voices of the community. We can co-design for anti-racism and anti-Indigenous racism on a policy level, with recognition that just not being racist isn't enough. And again, drawing on Leanne Beda Samosake Simpson about restoring Indigenous relationality. And while each individual must have the skills and knowledge to ensure their own safety, survival, and prosperity in both the physical and spiritual realm, their existence is ultimately dependent upon intimate relationships of reciprocity, humility, honesty, and respect with all elements of creation, including plants and animals. Indigenous knowledge systems and Western systems of knowledge are not categorically antithetical. By prioritizing epistemic heterogeneity, I think together they offer multiple points of entry into knowledge of the world, past and present, and can form our current understandings of not just education and mental health processes, but they also have something to tell us about science, technology, engineering, arts, math, cosmos, language, climate crises, and so on. We are ancestors to our future generations. And from this standpoint, I ask, are we collectively ready for a paradigm shift in the ways that we think about Indigenous mental health? I give thanks to each and every one of you, and I offer gratitude to you for being here today. I also dedicate this talk to the thousands and thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, both in Canada and the United States, to those families who are survivors of loss to death by suicide, and to those who are currently struggling.
Just want to take a moment for everybody to kind of reflect on that beautiful talk. I know there was a lot of moments in the chat when participants spoke about how much what you're saying really hit them. And I just know for me, it was so honest and really impactful. So we're so thankful to have you here today talking to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we're going to transition over to some questions and answer, or some questions that came up during your talk about implications and where we can go from here. But before we do that, I just wanted to read one of the comments that came up in the chat that someone wrote is, as a Native woman, this talk really made me feel safe and heard. And it's great to hear this at the academic level. I'm excited to see the impact. And I think that comment was just really powerful. For me, this talk was very different from what I've heard, but so honest and real. And so I just really appreciate all the personal stories and narratives that you placed in there. So if you're ready, let's dive into some questions. The first question was kind of more of a clarifying question that I wanted to have addressed. So this participant said, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. I really appreciate your forwarding of epistemic heterogeneity. I know in the social sciences, we see a lot of references to capital, such as like social capital or cultural capital. To clarify, is relationality the indigenous epistemological, of course, it's the hard word, epistemological alternative to such capital-based frameworks? If so, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I am completely not versed in all the ways that folks talk about social and cultural capital. And I would also be adverse to probably describing what I'm talking about in relation to anything that has capital in it. But yes, I think that if I were to make a guess, it probably is, the ways that our community runs, even when, it doesn't mean that we're without struggle, and it doesn't mean that we need to return back to the old ways as exactly the way that they are, right? Because when you think about the nature of knowledge too is dynamic in relation to social and cultural practices. So knowledge too needs to transform in relation to our contemporary and everyday experiences today. And so, but yet what we're talking about in terms of our Indigenous systems of relationality are these do function as ways to bolster individuals, families, and community members in our community to understand or believe that their community will come through for them during their greatest time of need. And it's a relational framework that, if I understand the limited understanding that I have of capital in the social sciences literature, I can imagine that is what it is. That is probably something similar, although we would never describe it like that.
Great. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah.
Another question that came up, and I'm going to combine two questions that are kind of related. What can be the role of non-Indigenous peoples, especially researchers, in research for Indigenous communities? And maybe some concrete steps about how we can help build the healing communities in research.
Yeah, thank you. I can draw on the Cow Papa Maori Indigenous methodologies framework that talks about whether or not non-Indigenous people can lead research projects in Indigenous communities, and they say no. And that doesn't mean, though, that non-Indigenous people can't do good work. And so I've been thinking a lot about what this might look like and what this means. And I kind of go back to a moment in my own personal experience where my brother was receiving a mask and going through some ceremony. And this is the kind of ceremony that white people are generally not invited to observe or bear witness to. And yet my husband is a white male. And I had to go to the elders in my family and ask, like, can he come? And what is the role of this? What is his role? And his role, they said, they gave him sort of a brief overview about appropriate behavior in that particular setting. But in essence, they said that you need to sit back and observe and eventually learn the rhythms of the community, which means for him that he had to figure out the ways that he could help. And I asked, I said to him, essentially, follow my brother Troy, because he'll be able to help you figure out where you can help. But this wasn't a ask the elders where you can help and keep asking, right? It was more of he needed to sit back and observe and do what he could to help, but do what he could to help that was based sort of on the natural rhythms of the community without interceding or interrupting or interjecting about what he thought we should be doing in those particular processes. So I think, yeah, there are ways that non-Indigenous folks can do really good work with Indigenous communities, but I go back to that ceremony, and I think that's where it needs to start from, because a lot of this thinking that we're doing and work that we're doing is informed by this deep system of understanding about who we are, and that's not really something that you could observe even as an excellent ethnographer for 30 years, right? It's not. It's something that is a lifelong process, particularly for folks who are not raised with that understanding. And it's imbued deeply with our contemporary unequal power structures that continue to impact the lives of everyday people, particularly those from communities of culture.
Thank you. I'm just processing that answer and thinking back to one of your earlier slides in your talk where you talked about like evidence-based models for who, and thinking about how we approach research. And what you're saying is really taking a step back and not being so action-oriented, but really learning from the people and communities you're trying to serve.
Yeah, thank you. And it's difficult, right? And there's a little bit, I'm guessing, of discomfort for people when they hear me say, there might not be a place for you to lead these projects. That's really uncomfortable, right? And yet at the same time, this is exactly that kind of discomfort that I'm saying we have to lean into if we actually want to disrupt some of these unequal power relations that have impacted our communities for as long as I've been around. The things that I'm sharing with you, they're not brand new, and they're not even my stories. These are stories and knowledge that have been transmitted across generations and from other folks who have shared their stories with me, and it's my responsibility to share them with you. And yet these are the same kinds of conversations and things that my dad was talking about 45 and 50 years ago. So we have to do better. And part of that doing better has to do with being able to be uncomfortable with some of these things in order to allow for some of that transformative agency to take place.
Thank you for sharing that. I know there's a lot of reactions in the chat just to that last comment you made, and how that's true, and that's what we need to hear, even though it makes us uncomfortable. There was another question. I'm going to shift a little bit to thinking about working with children and families. And so there was a question, I think this is the approach of kind of healing and dealing with trauma. How is this approach being used with very young children to address infant and toddler mental health and trauma? Or do you know how infant toddler mental health addresses kind of this with this lens?
I'm not actually versed in infant mental health at all. I have an expertise in early childhood. I was a preschool and kindergarten teacher for children aged 2.5 through 6, and through my academic education, gained expertise in an adolescent developmental period. But I imagine, when I observe young people on the land, for example, when we went out on that walk to do the biopsychosocial assessment, the young people are, I think that they would get the same kinds of things from sort of this embodied learning, this actively being present in their lives. These, we can call it attachment and healthy serve and response kinds of things, and really just expanding their attachment to these sort of healthy serve and response kinds of things to other and all of our beings. And I talk about these things, and often people say, oh, but this is about Indigenous psychology or Indigenous processes or Indigenous understandings of the world, and therefore has nothing to do with me. But the truth is, strengthening these relationships across people, plants, animals, and the natural world actually has something to do with all of us, right? So, and whether it's in science or education or mental health, or at a infant level in terms of our development? The answer is yes. Bring your kids outside and begin talking about the intersections of all of this, because none of us exist in isolation, and all of us are only here and only exist as humankind because of those relationships that we have to the world that sustains us.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, based on kind of your talk too, when we're thinking about infant and toddler mental health, it's really the relationship. So it's probably just as important to address what the families or the communities have gone through as well when you're trying to directly work with the children.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, now I'm going to shift gears to schools for you. Much of what you discussed today highlights the invisibility that results from widely used research approaches like randomized controlled trials. You also discuss cultural knowledge and tradition that allows community members to rely on one another. Given that the vast majority of teachers in the US are still white, what advice do you have for teachers serving Indigenous students, particularly as it relates to Indigenous mental health?
Thank you for that question. I think that's a really important question. And we often get boggled in the, am I doing this the right way? Or I don't really know what to do. First thing, I think that folks need to recognize the tribal nations on whose land they're on, and to begin figuring out for their specific community what it means to be in good relations with that tribe. And also, I think that folks need to bring their kids outside, right? We say in our communities that the land is the teacher and the land is the curriculum. If you begin observing the everyday processes outside, you're going to observe things such as seasonal changes and things that are being impacted by human extraction and those kinds of things, even if you were to walk, for example, outside. Now, a lot of my thinking here draws on some of the really excellent work by Dr. Phil Bell here in the College of Education, and also the Learning in Places curriculum that Dr. Megan Bang and her team have created, which are based in research and science about how to interact and observe and be in the world, whether it's in your local neighborhood, in an urban space, or if you have access to other outdoor spaces. I think that those are the two things: being in good relations with the tribal nation on whose land you are living and working, and that's a lifelong process, right? That's not just well, we reached out and nobody connected with us, or well, we invited someone to open this space. It's more of a continual process for you and your community and your institution to learn what this means, and also for teachers and other educators and practitioners to really just be outside. We don't have to necessarily be constrained by the four walls and expect that's how kids learn on its own. And now to also clarify, and to make sure that, folks know that this doesn't discount or mean that those other things don't have value, right? Because they do. Whether it's about data sovereignty and tribal nations developing their own understanding of COVID, for example, and their own kind of contact tracing protocols and those sorts of things, there are importance in some, so all of these different kinds of approaches and such. But what I'm saying is that we need to push back and expand our current understandings of where we're drawing knowledge, what counts as knowledge, and for whose benefit, et cetera, and to lean into the discomfort about, trying to do these things. Because even something like developing relations with the tribal nation, for some folks might not actually be super comfortable. And then we think, well, why? Why does that feel uncomfortable, right? And in what ways can we feel that without trying to move it or hide it or fade it or fix it or dismiss it? Right. And if we do that, I think that we can continue to so sort of through this embodied or somatic feeling of moving through that and doing those kinds of things. I think we can continue to develop, especially some of those really important cross-cultural relations that we're currently struggling with as a society.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question that's in the Q&A. So let's see how that goes. I appreciate that you've walked through colonial systems to be able to tell your story and complete research meaningful to you in the community. Can you please share a bit more about that experience? Can you share a bit around the experience of bringing Indigenous wisdom into academic and medical systems?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think it's all of our journeys, right, are some sort of an epistemic process, like our understanding of how we come to know across time. And my initial introduction to academia didn't have anything to do with Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous scholarship. And, yet I still made it through. As a young person, I was raised without running water or electricity up until the age of 10. And we also, and that the purpose of that was for us to get an understanding of what it means to be in relations with our natural world and our own cultural practices and ceremonies, etc. And of course, I also went to a private Catholic school. And you might think, whoa, that totally doesn't match up. But I recall fairly explicitly my parents saying things like, these are not your stories, but you need to go and find and do things. You need to go sort of learn that system and find something that resonates with you. And so that's sort of how I initially started. And then as I entered grad school, it was similar. I needed to find something that resonated with me. And then ultimately and finally, when I was introduced to Indigenous knowledge and scholarship, even that transition, I think back about my dissertation and the story that I shared about talking about life. It was after I had completed all of my interviews and told, I was talking to Dr. Graham Smith in a lobby at some conference, and I shared with him my dissertation work and what folks in the community were saying. And he looked at me and he said, so what they're telling you is that it's time to talk about life. And then all of a sudden my mind was blown because my entire dissertation was about trying to understand why our young people are dying by suicide. And then in retrospect, as I went back to all of the different interviews that I had, there was only one person out of 26 interviews that even used the word suicide. And that was because I had already introduced it in a question. And so that was really sort of eye-opening to me, which, does that mean that my entire dissertation was wrong? Not necessarily, but this is sort of my own journey about getting to where I got to, right? So they're saying we need to talk about life. They're saying that our cultural and ceremonial practices matter. They're saying that largely some of these approaches to suicide or depression or anxiety or substance use were not working for our people. They were telling me stories about how their loved one had gone off the treatment and how they were successful, and time again they would return back to the community and relapse and then feel terrible about themselves as if they were a bad person or something like that. And yet, that was this recognition that, wait a second, they're not bad people. They're not making a mistake. They're not bad at this sobriety thing, right? So what is it that's happening? And it was because of this idea of healing and social and cultural practices. So when I think about sort of my own journey about coming to be in these spaces, there's some folks, I've given presentations and the evaluations turn out, like where did she get her education, and how is this even scientific, and some evaluations like that. And yet largely, I think that folks want to participate in the transformation, right? I'm not the only one who can look at data for the past 40 years, whether it's education or mental health, and see that there hasn't been much of a shift in terms of that needle. We're still not serving our communities of culture. We're still not serving our LGBTQ and Two-Spirit folks, right? So most of the people that I know and most of the spaces that I present in are generally open because they want to help figure out how we can respond and transform the predicaments that people face.
Well, we just want to thank you again for sharing this amazing presentation. I know it was really powerful, and I'm excited to continue the conversation moving forward. And for every participant, thank you also for joining us. If you can please fill out the session evaluation that's on the screen or in the link in the chat box. It is required by our funder that allows us to have these presentations. So it'd be great if everybody can please fill it out and give us some feedback about how we can continue to do these presentations moving forward.
Yeah,
Now, anything else?
No, thank you for the invitation to speak today. I appreciate it. And I give thanks to each and every one of you for joining me.
Thank you so much.